It is not a fear that makes the heart race. It does not cause scares or crises, and yet it decides far more than it seems. Billy Graham observed that some of the deepest controls in human life do not come from panic, but from this discreet fear that disguises itself as caution and common sense. A person keeps living, choosing, avoiding certain paths without fully realizing why. Nothing seems wrong, nothing feels frightening, but something slowly begins to close in. This reflection begins at that difficult point to identify. When fear does not interrupt life, it simply starts to guide it. This fear is rarely recognized as fear. It does not appear as a clear threat or an intense sensation. On the contrary, it presents itself as something reasonable, a constant caution, an excessive attention to consequences, a permanent concern with not making mistakes, not losing, not exposing oneself more than necessary. The person does not feel afraid. They feel prudent. They learn to choose familiar paths, safe decisions, positions that do not draw attention. None of this seems negative at first glance. Life remains organized. Choices make sense. There are no obvious regrets. And yet, something begins to narrow. This fear operates in the details, in conversations that never happen, in opportunities that are postponed without a clear reason, in desires that are quickly dismissed for seeming impractical. The person does not feel blocked. They simply adapt. They keep adjusting their life to avoid discomforts that never quite materialize. Over time, this control starts to guide important decisions, not because something is impossible, but because it feels emotionally too risky. There is no traumatic event behind it, no dramatic story to explain it. There is only an internal habit of restraint that strengthens with every avoided choice. Many people live this way without realizing it. They do not feel explicit fear, they feel responsibility. They do not feel limitation, they feel maturity. This is the most delicate point of the conflict. Fear becomes confused with virtue. It presents itself as care, as balance, as common sense, and because of that, it is rarely questioned. This state is common precisely because it does not cause immediate suffering. Life does not fall apart. Relationships continue. Work moves forward. Everything seems stable. But this stability is built on small, constant renunciations, almost always silent, almost always justifiable. Little by little, the person begins to live more in response to what could go wrong than to what could be lived. Not out of intense anxiety, but out of anticipation, a permanent adjustment to keep everything under control. Fear does not appear as a strong emotion, it appears as a criterion. This is the central conflict. A fear that does not scare, does not paralyze, does not draw attention. A fear that integrates itself into the way one thinks, decides, and lives. It does not stop life from continuing. It simply defines its limits. And that is exactly why so many live under this control without ever naming it as fear. Billy Graham understood this kind of fear as a continuous internal state, not a momentary reaction. For him, there was an important difference between feeling fear in specific situations and living guided by it without realizing it. The second case was more common and at the same time harder to recognize. In the way he observed human beings, this fear emerged when a person began to organize life around constant prevention. It was not about cowardice or weakness. It was about an excessive focus on what could go wrong. Life went on, but every choice was filtered through a silent calculation of emotional risk. Billy Graham noticed that in this state, a person rarely feels afraid. They feel responsible, careful, realistic. Fear ceases to be an emotion and becomes an internal criterion. It does not appear as obvious tension, but as an invisible boundary that defines how far one can go. For him, this control was built gradually. Small experiences of frustration, rejection, or loss taught the person to protect themselves. Over time, that protection stopped being an occasional response and became a way of living. There was no longer a direct confrontation with fear because it had already been integrated into decisions. Billy Graham observed that this kind of fear is often socially valued. It looks like maturity, like prudence, like self-control. That is why it is rarely questioned. The person is recognized for being balanced, for not taking too many risks, for keeping everything under control. Internally, however, something begins to contract. In his view, the problem was not in being careful, but in living only from caution. When every choice is made to avoid discomfort, life becomes too predictable, too safe, and, little by little, limited, not because of a lack of ability, but because of excessive restraint. Billy Graham did not treat this fear as something to be eliminated. He saw it as something to be noticed. While fear remains hidden, it directs life without opposition. When it is recognized, it stops being an automatic controller and becomes just one part of the human experience. This understanding did not offer quick answers. It simply revealed something important. Many people are not trapped by great fears, but by small, constant adjustments made to feel no fear at all. And in that process, they end up living within limits that were never consciously chosen. In everyday life, this type of fear finds room to persist without resistance. The rhythm is organized. Choices are carefully considered. Routines are adjusted to reduce unpredictability. The person learns to value stability, predictability, and control. All of this seems like a sign of maturity, and in many ways it is. The problem arises when this caution begins to guide almost every decision. Not only the big ones, but the small ones as well. What to say and what to keep silent, where to go and where not to go, how much to expose oneself, how much to get involved. There is no internal command saying, "Don't do it." There is only a constant inclination toward what feels safer. At work, this may show up as avoiding moves that bring too much visibility. Not because of a lack of competence, but because the possibility of making a mistake weighs more than the possibility of growth. In relationships, it appears as emotional restraint. The person remains available, but rarely shows themselves fully. Not out of disinterest, but out of fear of losing control of the situation. Modern life reinforces this behavior. It values calculated decisions, minimal risk, predictable paths. Making mistakes is costly. Exposing oneself can lead to lasting consequences, so fear does not need to impose itself. It is learned, absorbed, reinforced daily by ordinary experiences. Over time, the person begins to confuse this restraint with identity. They believe this is just how they are, that they have always been this way, that they prefer it like this. Little by little, it goes unnoticed that many choices were made more to avoid discomfort than to affirm real desires. Perhaps you recognize this in simple situations: a conversation postponed indefinitely, an invitation declined without a clear reason, a decision maintained for years simply because it feels safe. None of this seems serious on its own, but together it draws the outline of a carefully contained life. Billy Graham observed that this type of fear doesn't create visible conflicts. It creates a life that is correct, organized, socially accepted. The cost appears more slowly. The person begins to feel that they live within limits that are too narrow, even without knowing exactly when those limits were set. The routine continues. Days repeat themselves. Everything works. And yet, a difficult-to-explain feeling arises, that many choices were not made out of desire, but out of precaution, not because there were no other possibilities, but because silent fear always arrived first to decide what was acceptable to live. There are moments when there are no decisions to make, nothing urgent, nothing to solve. The day slows down, and the person is left alone with themselves. It is in this interval that something begins to appear more clearly, not as declared fear, but as restraint. A sense that many inner movements were interrupted before they even took shape, not by external prohibition, but by a habit of holding back. Alone, without needing to keep anything under control, the person realizes how accustomed they have become to avoiding saying certain things, avoiding trying, avoiding getting involved beyond what feels necessary. There is no clear memory of when this began. Only the realization that it has always been this way, or at least that it seems as though it always has been. In that moment, a strangeness arises that is hard to ignore. Life seems organized but narrow, proper yet contained. There are no clear regrets, but there is a sense that much was lived only halfway. Not for lack of explicit courage, but because of excessive caution. Fear does not appear as an intense emotion. It appears as a lack of movement. as choices that were never even considered, as paths discarded before they were ever evaluated. All of this becomes visible only when the noise of the day fades. There is no conclusion here, there is no judgment, only the uncomfortable perception that this fear never needed to frighten in order to exert control. It simply settled into the silence of the days, guiding decisions while life went on as usual. When this fear guides choices for years, its effects begin to appear on a broader scale, not as collapse but as wear. The person realizes they have spent a long time adjusting their life to avoid loss, embarrassment, or frustration. The result is a stable existence, yet limited by decisions that were never fully chosen. This constant control consumes emotional energy. Staying alert to what might go wrong requires continuous vigilance. Even when nothing happens, there is an effort to ensure that nothing happens. The person remains watchful, restrained, calculating. Over time, this leads to fatigue, not an obvious physical tiredness, but an exhaustion tied to the permanent need to protect oneself. The consequences also appear in the relationship with oneself. It becomes harder to identify what one truly wants. Desires are quickly filtered by the question, is this safe? Many ideas never get the chance to mature. They are discarded early on, not because they lack meaning, but because they carry some degree of uncertainty. There is also a cumulative emotional impact. Life continues, but certain parts remain largely unexplored. Conversations that never took place, decisions that were postponed until they lost relevance, inner movements that were interrupted before becoming real. There is no explicit regret, but a diffuse sense of restriction. Over time, this way of living can generate a growing sense of strangeness. The person looks at their own history and recognizes coherence, continuity, responsibility. At the same time, they find it difficult to deeply identify with what they have lived. Everything seems correct, but there is a lack of intensity of presence. Because this fear never frightened, it never demanded confrontation. It became part of the internal functioning. That is why its consequences are noticed late, not as a mistake but as a limit. The person begins to feel they have lived within margins that are too narrow, without knowing exactly when they agreed to them. Perhaps the deepest effect is this: a gradual reduction in the sense of inner freedom. Not external freedom, but the freedom to allow oneself to consider, to try, to feel. Fear did not prevent life from happening. It merely ensured that it happened within rigid boundaries, defined more by prevention than by conscious choice. At some point, without clear warning, a different awareness emerges. It is not an organized thought, nor a conclusion. It is simply the sense that life was shaped more by what needed to be avoided than by what needed to be lived. This awareness does not accuse, it only reveals. The person begins to notice the difference between care and control. Care protects, control restricts. For a long time, both seemed like the same thing. Fear presented itself as responsibility, as balance, as maturity. Only later does it become clear that it also defined the inner space of choice. This awareness does not arise as immediate regret. It arises as strangeness, the impression that many decisions were made before they were ever felt, as if life had been guided by a constant filter, always attentive to risk, rarely attentive to desire. At this level of perception, fear stops being an abstract idea and becomes recognized as a continuous presence. Not a loud presence, but a constant one. It has been there in almost every choice, defining limits, reducing possibilities, guiding what seemed acceptable to feel and to live. Billy Graham observed that this kind of awareness does not demand immediate action. It asks for attention. Recognizing that part of one's life has been lived under restraint changes the way the past is seen, but it does not require quick corrections. It requires only internal honesty. This layer offers no answers. It simply opens space to notice something essential. Not every fear needs to frighten in order to govern. Some simply settle in as a pattern, and perceiving this already alters, in a subtle way, the relationship with one's own way of living. Perhaps the most decisive fear is not the one that paralyzes, but the one that was never recognized. It caused no crises, it triggered no alarms, it was simply present in almost every decision. Billy Graham observed that many of the limits of human life are not imposed from the outside, but accepted internally over time, not out of weakness, but out of adaptation. A person learns to live within what feels safe and, without realizing it, begins to call that choice. This reflection does not end here. It usually continues later, when one looks back more carefully, or when one notices in ordinary moments how much certain decisions are still born from restraint. Not as guilt, but as recognition. I suggest that you subscribe to the channel to continue following reflections offered at this calm pace, with depth, focused on human experiences that are rarely spoken aloud, always inspired by the attentive way Billy Graham observed the inner lives of people. This channel is a space for those who prefer to think more carefully, without haste, and without ready-made answers. If at any point in this video you recognized yourself, the comments are open as a simple place for expression. It can be a short sentence, a memory, or simply a note of what stayed with you. Sometimes noticing and naming is already enough for that fear to stop deciding everything on its own.